Incoming United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres last week urged European Union politicians and bureaucrats to ignore voters and open up their borders, claiming the growing Islamic tsunami of African and Middle Eastern immigration into the West was inevitable anyway. Critics were outraged. Speaking like a committed globalist, the socialist UN boss also argued that multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multicultural societies would be the only ones to succeed. On a visit to communist China this week, though, not a word was said by the new UN chief about the brutal regime's penchant for kidnapping savagely persecuted North Koreans and sending them back to be tortured and then murdered by the most barbarous totalitarian dictatorship on the planet. Instead, Guterres praised the communist tyrants in Beijing, currently engaged in what experts call the cultural genocide of Tibet, and encouraged the regime to continue pursuing its leadership role in what the UN refers to as global governance. At a think tank conference for European policymakers in his hometown of Lisbon, dubbed Vision Europe Summit, Guterres attacked the idea that sovereign nations have a right to control their borders. The idea that management of migration is a matter of national sovereignty is extremely limited, he was quoted as saying in European media reports later picked up by Breitbart. The truth is that in the meantime, the real controllers of international mobility are the smugglers and criminal organizations. It must be recognized that migration is inevitable and will not stop. In essence, Guterres argued that only open borders and legal mass migration could shut down people smuggling organizations. Developing legal migration opportunities, the incoming UN boss said, is the only way to fight against criminal networks. Similar arguments might be made for burglary, rape, racketeering, assassination services, abortion, and more. Just legalize it, then criminals will not control the market for it. Other top UN officials, such as Bilderberg operative, Goldman Sachs man, and UN Migration Czar Peter Sutherland have made similarly outrageous remarks. I will ask the governments to cooperate, to recognize that sovereignty is an illusion, that sovereignty is an absolute illusion that has to be put behind us, Sutherland argued last year in an official UN publication. The days of hiding behind borders and fences are long gone. In short, the UN is waging open war on national sovereignty, in part through its extreme demands for open borders and mass immigration into the West. Guterres was also clear in his recent remarks, politicians and policymakers must ignore citizens and voters in order to choose the values of open borders and the end of nations. When elected officials hesitate to choose between values and the next election, I would advise them to choose values, he said, with values standing not for traditional Judeo-Christian values or even democratic values of self-government, but rather, for extremist globalist and socialist values. If they go for short-term, electoral gain, they will lose both, because there will always come a time when they lose an election. At that point, it becomes very hard to recover the values that have been abandoned. The longtime Socialist Party leader, who served as the Prime Minister of Portugal and led the globalist and totalitarian-minded Socialist International Alliance for 5 years, also argued, yet again, that the massive migration swamping the Western world is not the problem, but the solution. In a TV interview earlier this year, Guterres, who led the UN refugee bureaucracy before being selected to lead the full dictator-dominated UN, referred to opponents of open borders as irrational. Migration is, in my opinion, part of the solution to the global problems, he added, without specifying which alleged problems open borders would supposedly solve. Despite calling for ignoring or outright defying voters, Guterres also suggested that governments should manipulate public opinion by trying to convince their subjects that the open borders extremism is actually good for them. We must convince Europeans that migration is inevitable and that it is the multi-ethnic societies which are multicultural and multi-religious who are building wealth, he said. Critics, though, blasted the false claims, and suggested the comments urging policymakers to defy the citizens they ostensibly represent and serve were dangerous, outrageous, and extreme. Breitbart London also cited a growing body of data showing that, rather than making European countries more prosperous, massive third world immigration is serving as a huge drain on public funds. In the Netherlands, for example, some 2/3 of non-European immigrants who arrived during the 1990s are still living on tax-funded welfare payments, according to Dutch research. Similar trends have been observed in other European nations with bloated welfare states and massive immigration. Other critics of the open borders extremism touted by Guterres and his comrades have been even more blunt. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, for example, has argued that globalist engineered wave of Islamic immigration into Europe was orchestrated by a treasonous conspiracy. The goal of the internationalist fanatics behind the plotting, he said, was to undermine the West, Christianity, culture, and the nation-state itself as part of the globalist push to create what establishment figures around the globe often describe as a new world order. UN and EU bureaucracies are all on the bandwagon, too. UNESCO, for example, which is seeking to globalize the indoctrination of children, recently helped produce a TV commercial encouraging German women to wear Islamic headscarves as part of tolerance. The UN refugee bureaucracy, meanwhile, is in charge of selecting immigrants from around the world to be settled in the United States at taxpayer expense. And the extremism is only getting worse. Ironically, Guterres' comments in Lisbon last week were a sharp contrast to those made before a brutal totalitarian regime. The new UN boss, set to take office on January 1, was in China to meet with its brutal Communist Party dictator, Xi Jinping. His regime fervently backed socialist Guterres after Bulgarian Communist Party operative and UNESCO boss Irina Bokova's campaign for the post imploded amid scandal and public exposure. China is more and more involved in international affairs, and that is very much welcomed, Guterres told the regime's propaganda and espionage service Xinhua. But unlike his comments to European leaders urging them to defy voters and open the borders, there was no lecturing of the savage Chinese regime by Guterres on refugees or opening its own borders. And that is despite the fact UN itself documented that Beijing has forcibly returned tens of thousands of North Korean refugees, knowing full well that they would be imprisoned, tortured, and executed by Beijing's close barbarous ally Kim Jong-un. The regime in China calls the North Koreans economic migrants and claims they are not entitled to protection, sending them home to face a certain murder following savage torture. Instead of urging Beijing to stop murdering North Koreans, persecuting Christians, harvesting organs from Falun Gong practitioners, censoring the internet, jailing and torturing critics, forcing women to abort their children, and other barbaric practices, Guterres had nothing but praise for the tyrants in Beijing. According to the left-wing establishment mouthpiece New York Times, Mr. Guterres' visit, which ended on Tuesday, was another chance for China to promote its growing role in global governance. Mr. Guterres praised China during his visit, the Times added. The feeling was apparently mutual, with the dictator, Xi, showering praise on the UN Dictators Club and calling it the most universal, representative and authoritative intergovernmental international organization. Indeed, as the New American has reported in a series of in-depth investigations, the brutal regime in Beijing, installed with crucial support from Western globalists, is set to play a key role in the so-called New World Order being imposed on humanity. Guterres expressed delight at the growing role the Chinese Communist Party is playing in global governance. The new UN chief's affinity for open borders and brutal communist dictatorships, though, is hardly surprising. As this magazine documented when his selection was announced, Guterres has a long history of promoting socialism, globalism, and other violent extremism. Perhaps among the most significant red flags, no pun intended, on Gutierrez's troubling regime was his presidency, from 1999 to 2005, of the Socialist International. Often referred to as SI, the outfit is a global alliance of socialist and communist political parties from around the world, including many rebranded former communist parties from the Cold War era that murdered and tortured huge numbers of people. Despite the lack of coverage the outfit receives from the US establishment media, the SI alliance is extraordinarily powerful, especially at the UN, where its members control a massive voting bloc and multiple UN bureaucracies. The outfit is also extremely radical and dangerous. To understand just how extreme Socialist International is, consider that, in 2012, the alliance unapologetically held its annual congress in an African nation led by a Marxist-Leninist SI member political party that, according to leading genocide experts, was at that very moment engaged in the planning and preparation phase of genocide in a bid to exterminate an embattled minority group. Earlier that year, the president and party chief who hosted the SI Congress even went on national television to sing songs in front of his military celebrating massacring members of the minority group with his machine gun. SI profusely praised its hosts nonetheless. Unsurprisingly, the brutal communist regime in Beijing was represented at the summit, too. Vice Minister of the International Department of the Communist Party of China Central Committee Liu Jiayi, for example, lectured assembled attendees on the social democratic response to the financial crisis. Seriously. Representatives from murderous and unfree regimes and totalitarian parties from around the world were also in attendance, demanding more global governance, more wealth redistribution from Western taxpayers to their corrupt governments, what they call global welfare statehood, and other extremism. SI has previously called for world government in official statements. Gutierrez called for Western governments to defy voters and citizens, and his ludicrous claim that immigration policy is not a matter of national sovereignty, illustrate perfectly why the United States must urgently exit the UN and evict its headquarters from US soil. Legislation to do that, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act, is already sitting in Congress waiting for enough public pressure to force its passage. With globalists increasingly coming out of the closet with their dangerous totalitarian extremism, the time to demand an American exit from the UN, or an